welcome everyone to this Linnean lens on Darwin's Vasculum. I'm absolutely delighted today to have not one but two speakers, and before I introduce them, I just want to highlight what a feat of organization this has been. And I'm going to show you what this looks, because normally we've got, for anyone who has been on one of our Linnean lens, we have another camera and the documents, and sometimes an external speaker. But in this case, we have two speakers, and we're intending to show you several Vasculums. We have our librarian, Will, sitting there in the middle to try and convey the material to people. Here's Glenn at one desk, and at the other desk, we have Régine. I'm just showing you this just to beg you to be patient in case things go slightly wrong in the process of dealing with 4 cameras, 1 PowerPoint, various Vasculums, and 3 speakers. But hopefully we can get through this unscathed and convey a little of the excitement we have about Vasculums in this next session. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Régine Fabri has come all the way from Belgium. Régine is a botanist, and she is now a retired librarian from the Meise Botanic Garden in Belgium. And she is here because she's recently produced this little lovely book on the Vasculum in French, but it is absolutely packed with illustrations and information on the history of the Vasculum. So Régine is going to start this session by talking a little bit about the history of the Vasculum with a PowerPoint, and then she'll pass on to Glenn Benson, who his day job is at the Victoria and Albert Museum, but he is our honorary curator of artifacts here at the Linnean Society, and he will focus the second half of the talk on Darwin's Vasculum, which you can see at the top there through our document viewer. I think that's it. I think I haven't forgotten anything. So without further ado, I will pass on to Régine to tell us a little bit about the history of the Vasculum. Over to you, Régine. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to the Linnean Society for inviting me. I have to share the screen and then to find my presentation here. Okay, so my grandmother, Hortense, I have a problem to go to the next slide. Et tout à l'heure, il est là.
Sorry, okay.
Okay. With the mouse.
I'm turning this down.
Okay, yeah. Okay. My grandmother, Hortense, was a botanist amateur and made an herbarium. A few years ago, I inherited the nicely decorated botanical tin box that she had received in the first years of the last century when she was still a young girl. At the same time, a colleague of mine asked if someone had a Vasculum or botany box to loan for an exhibition. I did not know that those boxes were called Vasculum and were a real scientific device, not only destined for children like my grandmother's book. That was the reason why I began looking for more information about that equipment. I found out so many pictures and mention, as well in scientific as in non-scientific literature, that I eventually decided to complete the history of the botanical collecting box that was scarcely drafted by Günther Schmidt in 1936, then a bit more sketched by Herbert Baker and David Allen at the end of the 50s. Until the Renaissance, the botanists were mainly herborists, pharmacists, chemists, druggists, or physicians. They collected medicinal plants in baskets, but did not assemble herbarium collection. At the beginning of the 16th century, an Italian physician and botanist created one of the first herbarium with pressed and dried plants. It became then more important to preserve the plants collected on the field in good condition. Otherwise, it would not be possible to study and to identify the herbarium specimen afterwards. The first mention of a box being used for collecting plants is found in Great Britain in 1704. Student physicians at Cambridge University started to go on plant collecting field trips armed with candle boxes. At that time, candles were the main source of light, and people protected them from mice and rats in cylindrical copper, then tin boxes from which the design and dimensions were perfectly fitted to take them along on the field to collect plants. 1 century later, students were still using these common candle boxes, but well-to-do physicians and chemists had the tin man manufacture their boxes on custom. Linnaeus called this botanical collecting box a Vasculum, a Latin word meaning small container. In German, it was called a Botanisiertrommel, literally meaning a botanical barrel. Probably used for the first time in Great Britain in the 18th century, the Vasculum became a very common object in the 19th century and an essential device for botanists. It could be found everywhere. For example, in 1828, in the description of an inn in the British countryside, from which the owner was also an amateur botanist, we can read, "Mes botanistes continue to find at this humble inn cleanliness and civility, a trowel to decor their plants, and even a vasculum to secure them." Plant hunters over the world often mention their boxes in their travel reports. Maybe Humboldt and Bonpland were the first bringing it to America in 1799. Boris de Saint-Vincent used a vasculum when he went to the Mascarene Island at the same time. And 20 years later, Prime Verlesson had also a box for his expedition to Oceania. But only a few boxes survived this far expedition, as Darwin's box or Joseph Dalton Hooker's box given to Colenso in New Zealand. Many pictures and portraits show 19th century botanists with a collecting box. Most botanists have used and reused their boxes in the field, sometimes in the rain. They have filled them with plants from which the roots were covered with earth and small stone. They have opened and closed their box very often, without specifically caring after their equipment. Thus, most of outer vasculum have been thrown away. Nevertheless, a few ones owned by famous botanists or by anonymous plant lovers are still conserved. The oldest books I could find are dating from the second half of the 18th century. They belonged to the Scottish botanist George Donne Senior and to the French Antoine Laurent de Jussieu. Around the world, in the United States, Canada, Oceania, United Kingdom, and continental Europe, botanical institutes and museums own historical vasculums in their collections. Some private collections also exist. In the second half of the 19th century, the boxes were no longer custom-made by craftsmen, but industrially produced by specialized companies, as several other devices and tools to study natural science. In Paris, for example, between 1862 and 1938, 3 different companies were proposing a selection of 2 models in 8 dimensions, from 20 to 90 centimeters long. Till of this day, 1 company is still active in France, and a single model, 40 centimeters long, can be bought. In the British Isles, there were several companies, namely Baird and Tatlock, Flatters and Garnett, Philip Harris, Watkins and Doncaster, and Griffin and Georges. Botanical boxes were also produced and sold by German and American companies, among others. To avoid rust, the boxes were often painted in black in the British Isles and in North America, in green in continental Europe. The British boxes are also quite flat and the continental more cylindrical. In the 19th century, the vasculum was a marker of the botanist collector. It was an emblem of the societal prize praised in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Botanical Letters. The benefits and delight of the herborization are often described. Studying and collecting plants is considered as a sound activity for everybody, including women, young girls, and children. The box was a sign of recognition too. A young botanist apologized to George Donne because he approached him without an introductory letter. George Donne answered him, pointing at his Vasculum, "That is introduction enough to me." Organizing a meeting between two botanists who did not know each other, a French professor said that we would easily recognize each other. He was a bicycle, a green Vasculum, and a flower on his lapel. Problem to go to the next. Okay. Despite the fact that the botany box had become quite common, it remained sometimes a strange and worrying device. Some French and Belgian botanists have been suspected of smuggling, even arrested and jailed, because they were bearing Vasculum. In Australia, a British economist and plant lover has been accused of trafficking fake jewelry in his collecting box. Students from the University of Brussels working in the fields have also been suspected of hiding stolen potatoes in their boxes. And in southern France, some botanists have been taken for poachers. The Vasculum was also used for other purposes. Some botanists put their sandwiches in it when they went out in the field and their plant collection when they returned. It is also used by entomologists on the field to put their insect collections. Many scientific reports, publications, and correspondence mention the collecting box, and most floras written in the 19th century describe the Vasculum that all botanists should use for collecting plants. We also find many mention of Vasculum in the non-scientific literature, mainly in the literary realism and naturalism, as by Émile Zola or Jules Verne. It appears also in educative books, as The Wonderful Adventures of Niels by the Swedish Selma Lagerlöf, in juvenile fiction, as A World of Ice by Robert Michael Ballantyne, and even in crime fictions by Arthur Conan Doyle, as in a novel by Virginia Woolf. Botanical boxes are also represented on numerous artistic illustration and painting, mainly by artists from Central Europe. Problème. Bizarre. Several botanists herborizing in the Alps are found in the works of the Swiss Romantic painter Raphael Ritz. Notice the goat on the painting at the left side, eating the contents of the botanical box. The German genre, next please. The German genre painter Hermann Kern represented botanists as joyful men drinking wine or beer in a cellar. Next. We can notice on this engraving made after that painting by Ziermann that the activity of the botanist seems more important than the reality of the botanical environment. Indeed, the broadleaf cattails that the man is trying to hang with his walking stick are replaced by common reeds, Phragmites. At the foundation of the Botanical Institute of Montpellier in 1890, two big paintings showing botanists in the lab and on the field were ordered to decorate the main entrance hall. The Vasculum is here the link between the field and the lab. Next. In the council room of the City Hall of Laken, near Brussels, a fresco displays an allegory of the science. On the central panel, a botanist looking at a plant with his vasculum on the ground in front of him. The main hall of the Faculty of Pharmacy in Paris is decorated with a painting of a botanical field trip representing botanists collecting with their boxes and an herbarium press on the foreground in trompe-l'œil. Next. Children with botanical boxes are also figured. Notice the nice embroidered ribbon holding the box on the right painting. Next. The fashion of decorated box caught on in Germany. That was the first country to introduce botany lessons in the primary school program at the end of the 19th century. Most of those decorated boxes were manufactured by the Martin Company, renowned for its tin toys, especially electrical trains. They were also produced by other companies, mainly in Central Europe and even in Belgium. But it seems that no decorated boxes were crafted in Great Britain nor in the United States. Next. You can notice on those pictures that the professors and the male students have big, plain, dark or light boxes, and the girl students smaller decorated boxes. Next. After World War II, in the 50s, the vasculum progressively disappeared and was replaced by plastic bags, or the plants were directly put in a press on the field. At the end of the 70s, David Allen called for the conservation of the vasculum, and Mary Briggs organized the collection of old boxes by the Botanical Society of the British Isles. She made them available to the members, and several boxes were given new life. The loan system worked at least until the early 2000s. Today, only a few people are still using a vasculum, as several members of the Société Botanique de France. Next. Decorated boxes have now become collectible items, as in the private museum of the lithographed tin box in Belgium. Next. They can be found on eBay, for example, but they are sometimes quite expensive. This beautiful French decorated box in good condition was sold at more than $500. Next. Unfortunately, I'm not the buyer, but I must admit that I started a collection with now 20 boxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Régine, and apologies, Régine had a really dodgy mouse. Nothing was working to change slides. So thank you, Régine. Before we move on to the Darwin Vasculum, Glenn and Régine are both going to show you on camera some of the actual vasculums that, well, we have. One is from our own staff, one of our staff members, and the other ones have all been brought here by Glenn. So, Régine, do you want to start? I think you've got a candle box to show first.
Yes, you can see here a candle box. It's quite different from a real vasculum. This is fully cylindrical. There is no attached for a strap, but you can notice there two little gates to fix the box on the wall. And the box is around 25 centimeters long. Another box, this one, is a bigger box, more than 40 centimeters long. It's a typical continental European one with ovoid or mostly cylindrical shape and painted in green. And you can see here the attach for the strap. Now, Glenn, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. So I've got two later vasculums. This is I think going by Régine's discussion earlier, this is a sort of British style, which is much flatter. And I'd say is often the one that some people use as a sandwich container these days, sometimes sold on eBay as metal handbags as well. But I'm just going to try and show you sort of the inside here. And so this is a much more modern Vasculum, and so it has a kind of coated interior. And as I say, and it has this sort of more flattened cylindrical shape. Similarly, we have another kind of 20th century, probably British one. And again, this one is of a different, is that sort of flattened cylinder shape. And again, it has its carrying handles, and this one has quite a difficult lid to prise open. I'm not sure this one's had much use. It's in quite pristine condition, as you might be able to see.
Do you want to tell whose this is for people who know Gina?
Gina, who is was a member of staff for the Linnean Society, is now honorary archivist, has obviously looked after this very well. You can see some rubbing on the front here, obviously where maybe typically a ring or something like that often does that when you're opening something like this, but it is in pretty good condition. So
I'm just saying this because I know there's a few members from the European Botanical and Horticultural Society, Libraries group in the audience, and they all know Gina Douglas. So this was Gina's. Glenn, I pass on to you to now turn to Darwin's Vasculum.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to look at is Darwin's Vasculum, and looking at it from the sort of perspective of a curator, really. So I'm interested in not only its construction and things like that, but also kind of its history and how the Vasculum came to the society. Knowing the provenance of an object is very important. And I just want to show you this one again, just so that you have in your mind a typical sort of flattish British Vasculum, because we're now going to look at the one that belonged to Darwin, and you'll see that it's a much more cylindrical thing. I'm going to have to stand up at this point, so and we'll switch cameras. So what we have here is Darwin's Vasculum, and this is about 40 centimeters long. It's 19 centimeters wide, and it's around 13 centimeters deep. I've got gloves on, and you can tell I'm the curator because I'm wearing gloves, because it has quite a friable surface. As Régine talked about, these tin plate boxes, and I'm just going to sort of lift this towards the camera, you can see that the Vasculum actually has kind of two layers. There's the base metal, which in this case is tin, and it has a sort of outer layer of probably some kind of paint, though you could also talk in terms of it being japanned, which is where you apply an outer coat of a substance to a base metal object like this. That outer coating from use has come away. And it's interesting that one end seems to be much worse than others. So I do wonder whether this is the end that got more use. I'm reluctant to open it, I have to be honest, because at some stage in its history, this hinge has been broken and has been very poorly repaired. You can see the difference between this perfect hinge, which is here, and this one here, which is sort of been repaired. But that to me says that this has been a well-used item, and that's reassuring to a curator like me. If it was perfect, I'd be a little bit nervous. Inside, we now know from a conservation report that we had done in 2017 that at some stage inside the Vasculum, it was painted with perhaps some sort of rubberized, some sort of maybe even rubber sort of coating. It's impossible to say when that was done. We know it's degrading, and that's certainly something, one of the reasons why we keep the box closed, not only to protect the hinge, but also to stop the light getting in and impacting on that sort of rubber layer on the inside. But I say, what you can tell from here is that the slightly, just to remind you, the slightly different, more cylindrical shape of Darwin's actual Vasculum. So we need to just tell the backstory of this object, because that's what's kind of interesting to someone like myself. What tells us that this went to on the voyage of the Beagle with Darwin from 1831 to 1836. And it's been very reassuring to hear Régine talking about how commonplace vascular or vasculums were. And that's reassuring because it explains possibly why Darwin makes no mention of the vasculum in his writings. Not that I've found. And if anyone's out there screaming at the screen saying, that's not true, I know of a letter, I would love to see it. Because so far, trawling through many biographies of Darwin, through his letters, through the brilliant Darwin Correspondence Project, through the brilliant Darwin Online, there is no mention of a vasculum. It's not helped, of course, because as we've already experienced, vasculum is a term that's not always used. Sometimes they're called collecting boxes, sometimes they're called tin boxes, sometimes they're called specimen boxes. But trawling through the various documents, and thankfully there's now electronic document searching to help with this, none of those have come up as a term. Equally, during the voyage of the Beagle, there was no photographs taken, long before photography was invented, and also the artists who went on the voyage concentrated their efforts on capturing the environment, the landscape, the peoples that they encountered, the ship and things like that. And there are no contemporary portraits from the Beagle trip capturing the crew, of which there were over 70, including Darwin, who was there as the official naturalist. So I started to get a little nervous as to where was the evidence for Darwin's vasculum. What was the proof that this was really his, that it went on the Beagle? So it's reassuring to know that perhaps it was just so commonplace, it just wasn't worthy of mentioning. In Darwin's letters, he talks about buying a microscope. He sends a letter to his sister saying to Susan, please send me more shirts, and things like that. But there's no mention of his collecting box, probably because it was just so commonplace that he didn't need to mention it. A little bit like an artist talking about their brushes or talking about their palettes. They don't tend to do it. When Vasari wrote the great biography of the Renaissance artists, he didn't talk about their palettes or their brushes. These were just tools of the trade. So I suspect this is the same, is that you're talking at a keen botanist, just taking it for granted. As we've seen, it was just a symbol of being a botanist that you would have a vasculum and you would have sort of some sort of papers with you to press your specimens. So desperate to look for some kind of evidence of, I turned to my 1973, hopefully everyone can see this. So when I was 8, I was bought the Ladybird book of Charles Darwin, and this is my childhood copy. I was always born to work in museums because I've looked after it very well, and it shows, hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, a rather strapping Charles Darwin striding through the tropical forests of South America, carrying what looks like a large handbag, which of course is actually his vasculum. But this is a 1973 image, and therefore is completely fictitious. And there are many images from the 20th century of Darwin using some form of scientific instrument or something like a vasculum or something like that. But these are all fanciful. And I think during his lifetime, particularly in the 19th century, it was very much about Darwin being portrayed as a great thinker rather than a practical scientist. Of course, he did practical science, otherwise we wouldn't have had all the various books that he wrote on insectivorous plants and climbing plants and worms and all the other things that he produced. But in the images of him, certainly in the contemporary images of him, he's shown very much as a deep thinking man rather than a practical scientist. So where does our evidence come for the vasculum? And I'm going to turn to Will to bring me over one of our many albums of bound letters that we have. As you can imagine, the Society, having existed since 1788, has a large collection of documents relating to its history, to its fellows, to the things that have been donated, exhibitions that we've been involved with, works that we've been involved with, scientific studies that we've been involved with. And there is thank you very much. There's a continuous history of those letters being documented, added to our archive, and as is often the case, they are put into these large bound ledgers. And what we're looking at here is the bound ledger for about 1925, 1926. And what I'm just going to draw your attention to is a letter that we have on file from somebody called Edith Mary Wynne. And I'm going to stand up again. So, hopefully, I'm just going to move that into shot. So we're looking at this letter here, and it's in 2 pages. You won't be able to read it on screen, but I'm just going to tell you roughly the contents of it, which is that she writes to us. Thank you. my Ladybird book, look after it. She writes to us in October 1925, offering us what she describes as her father's most treasured possession. That was his Vasculum that was given to him, and I'm going to explain that story shortly. She also offers us some paintings and some books that he had collected, and as I say, these are detailed in this rather fragile letter from October 1925. She also very kindly sent us his obituary from the local newspaper. He died in 1924. And as the letter explains, one of his dying wishes, if you like, was actually for the Vasculum, the paintings and the books to be presented to the Linnean Society after his death. And so his daughter was dealing with that. So Edith Mary Wynne's father was Brian Wynne. And I'm going to sit down again, Padma. And Brian Wynne was the son of George Wynne. Bear with me, we have to just go through this slightly sort of family tree. But George Wynne, importantly, from 1858, was the gardener at the Mount, which is the family home of the Darwins. He had taken over the garden from a previous gardener. And being the Darwins, this isn't some ordinary garden. The garden was set up in 1799 by Charles Darwin's father, Robert. There's some wonderful diaries that recount planting trees from 1799 onwards. And Robert Darwin, who is a successful doctor, who marries Susanna Wedgwood and who comes with quite a hefty dowry, I think of about £25,000, buys some land on the edge of Shrewsbury in Shropshire, in the sort of where England meets Wales in the UK. And they buy initially about 5 acres of land. They end up with approximately something like 7 acres, which I think is about 2.8 hectares. They build a house, which takes from 1796 to 1800 to build. But they've already started on the garden before the house is finished. They move in the 1800s, and the Darwin family stays there until 1866, 1867. Importantly, George Wynne is engaged to look after these gardens after Robert has died, and stays there until Susan Elizabeth Darwin, Darwin's older sister, dies in the 1860s. As I say, this was no ordinary garden. Under Robert's tenure, so this is from 1800 through to about 1848, the garden was a laboratory, I think it's fair to say. They practiced different types of horticulture, they planted different species, they trialed different types and varieties of different plants. In 1831, which is the year that Darwin sails off on the Beagle, they actually had a hothouse built, and it was a considerable hothouse, and it cost them £746. This is in 1831, so that's like spending £50,000 today on building what was in effect a greenhouse. But it shows the commitment to gardening that they had, and it shows the fact that the whole garden was a sort of laboratory, I think, and a great experiment for them of different types of plants. And of course, being connected to the Wedgwoods and being connected to the Darwin family, they collected, they were sent specimens, and so the garden has an incredible range of flowers and ornamental plants, but also an extensive kitchen garden. And there's a lot of talk in Robert Darwin's diary about various trials that they did with growing fruit and vegetables. The reason I'm painting that picture is I just want to make you aware that Brian Wynne, son of George Wynne, who joins his father to help him garden, was kind of looking after quite a significant garden and how much of it was still being used for scientific purposes, I'm unclear about. But it's fair to say that Susan Elizabeth Darwin was also very interested in horticulture, and I think she would have probably maintained the gardens to a quite high standard. We certainly know that George Wynne was employed in October 1858, and within 2 years, Brian Wynne, who had initially started off as a solicitor, gives up on the desk job and would prefer to be with his father. I'm going to speculate at this point, because in March 1866, Brian Wynne leaves his father at the Mount and goes off to study horticulture at the Royal Horticultural Society at their gardens in Chiswick. We all know now today that the RHS, as we call it, is based in Wisley, but they didn't move to Wisley until 1903. So Brian Wynne goes off to study floriculture and horticulture and the growing of fruit and vegetables. And he qualifies in 1867. I think in March 1866, when he leaves for Chiswick, Susan Darwin gives him the Vasculum as a going away present. Why do I think that? Because in the letter from Edith Mary Wynne, it talks about her father being given the Vasculum at quite a young age. He would have been about 21 in 1866. Susan Elizabeth Darwin would have been about 63 at the time, and in fact she dies a few months later. But I speculate, and it is pure speculation, that she gave the Vasculum to Darwin as a sort of going away gift, which seemed appropriate for someone who was going off to study about horticulture with the Royal Horticultural Society. And that changes Brian Wynne's life, because he goes on to be a great horticultural writer. He joins the staff of what was called the Gardener's Chronicle. Now, this is a kind of very technical gardening magazine that was set up in 1841, and he works for them for 16 years, writing documents and articles about gardening and the sort of practicalities of gardening. In 1884, he leaves the Gardener's Chronicle and sets up his own Gardening World Illustrated magazine. And again, this was quite a serious publication on the sort of technical aspects of growing plants in your garden and growing fruit and vegetables. And he stays with the Gardening World Illustrated and becomes the editor until 1895. It's also interesting just to note that Brian Wynne was a Freemason, and he co-founds his own lodge in 1893. And he was a very charitable man and helps to set up in 1899 the Royal Gardeners Orphan Fund, a charity which sort of supports the families of people who work in the horticulture and agricultural world. What happens next, we're not completely clear, but we know, as I say, he dies in 1924. We have the lovely letter from Edith, his daughter, talking to us about how precious the Vasculum was to her father and how he would like it to come to the society. And this is where it also gets interesting for a curator, because what happens to it after it comes to us? I think it's kind of interesting that the Vasculum sat in the Mount for 30 years, between sort of 1836, when Darwin probably came back from the Beagle, bringing souvenirs and things back from his trip, leaving in his family home, to being given to Brian Wynne in 1866. It comes to the society in 1925. In May 29, we loan it to Down House. Down House, which is the house which Darwin then moved to. He moved from Shrewsbury to London to Kent, and his house in Kent in 1929 was sort of turned into a museum, and the Vasculum went on display there. And there's an interesting letter from us to Edith Mary Wynne saying, is it okay to loan the Vasculum to Down House for this exhibition? And she writes back, yes, it's okay, so long as the Vasculum remains the property of the Linnean Society. The Vasculum stays there for 28 years. And in 1957, the society goes, where's that Vasculum of Darwin's? And writes a letter to the owners of Down House, who it was moving from the British Society for Scientific advancement to the Royal College of Surgeons, and we asked for it back, and it was returned. And I suppose it was returned in time for the various centenary celebrations that were going to happen in 1958 to mark the centenary of the reading of The Origin of the Species in the Linnean Society, where we are today. And certainly there are, and I'm going to stand up again shortly, there are documents like this which show the celebrations for the centenary of the reading of The Origin of the Species. And in here it talks about Darwin's collecting box being on display. Equally, which I thought was rather amusing, this one actually has a newspaper cutting with it, which actually shows the live Galapagos tortoise that was also displayed at the same exhibition alongside Darwin's collecting box. And rather huge fence to keep a rather small tortoise under control at the event in 1958. Two histories of the Society have been written, one in 1938, one in 1988. Both of them fail to mention Darwin's Vasculum, as far as I can see, for whatever reason. Again, maybe because it wasn't, who knows? I have no idea. I don't want to speculate really. And we're trying to rectify that through the Linnean lens today. But also, if you've looked at our L50 book, which is the sort of treasures of the Linnean Society that we produced a couple of years ago, then we've given Darwin's Vasculum a bit of a prominence in that story of the treasures of the Society. And I'm really pleased as a curator of artifacts for the Society that some of these treasures are beginning to be given the kind of attention they deserve. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. And I look at that. I had L50 all ready to to show people. So you've given me the exact cue I needed. So this is the L50 books of treasure that Glenn was talking about. And indeed, there's a section in there on Darwin's Vasculum. And look, it's opened actually. So thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Régine, for brilliant presentations. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and there are a few in the Q&A box. So there's a few that have common themes. So I'm gonna take them together. The first, I guess, the first question is about is to you, Régine, and whether the book is going to be translated into English. Two people are wondering.
Isabel, yes. Could you ask Régine to turn her camera on? So
yes, Régine, could you turn your camera on?
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I just answered the question about an English translation. Nothing is planned until now, but I would be very happy if somebody proposed to do a translation or agree to for translating. I think my director could agree to publish the book by the Botanical Garden in English, but I want to insist, there are many illustrations in the book, nearly 300, so it is not necessary to read all, to learn something about the Vasculum. You can just look at the picture and admire them.
Yes, that's true. It's very, very rich in illustration. Sorry, I don't want to damage it by showing it too much. Thank you, Régine. The other type of question is about the vocabulary, actually. Someone says, isn't the Vasculum also known as the Linnaeus's box? And I saw in the chat somewhere earlier, someone else was saying, didn't Darwin just describe it as a tin box rather than a Vasculum? So I don't know, Glenn, do you want to answer first about Darwin, and then maybe Régine can say a few more words about the vocabulary used to describe Vasculums in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my experience of looking through the various documents, the terms interchange between collecting box, tin box, and things like that. And certainly there's a letter from about 1858 where Darwin is writing to, I think, one of his brothers, and he talks about his brother having a tin box. And the Darwin Correspondence Project have interpreted that expression as meaning a Vasculum. And so Yes, and when I was searching for some kind of reference material to Vasculum, I searched for all the kind of known phrases and terminology that it's often known as: collecting box, tin box, and so on. But as I only found one real letter where he talks about a tin box in the terms of it being for collecting specimens, though he often used tins to transport back to England specimens of other things. Things were often packed in tins to send them back to the UK, but that's the only reference I found.
Thank you. And Régine, I think there's a section in your book about the vocabulary used.
Yes, Linnaeus was the first to use the term vasculum, and he wrote vasculum Dillenianum. Dillen, to Dillenianum, was a German-English botanist, and Linnaeus had met him in Oxford only once. David Allen has looked for mentions of the vasculum by Linnaeus, but nothing can be found. And the epithet Dillenianum really early disappeared from the name, and we use only vasculum. It's funny to see that at the beginning, people named the vasculum as a living specimen. They use vasculum Dillenianum Linnae dot. As you can see, Homo sapiens, Linnaeus, L dot. This the term was taken as a scientific name, but the term vasculum was used mostly in English. In French, they say boîte d'herborisation, boîte à botanique, boîte à herboriser, or la boîte verte, just the green box. When they're speaking of a green box, everybody knows what they mean. And it's also interesting to know that in German, it's a Botanisiertrommel, but the children say Botterammisiertrommel. It's playing with the word. Botteram is a sandwich, and trommel is the box where they put their sandwich and the plants. Dus a Botanisiertrommel.
Very nice, thank you. There's quite a few questions about the practicalities of using a vasculum in the field. So maybe we can start with the box itself. So someone asked, what were the boxes lined with to protect the plants? And then someone else expresses a similar sentiment: in a plant press, plants are kept between newspapers, blotters, and cardboard. How were plants placed in vasculum? And as a kind of related question, how is it possible to collect different plants to the vasculum and not mix the specimens? Which actually we had lunch together, all three of us, and we were discussing this. So Régine, do you want to have a go?
Yes, in the Floras of the 19th century, we can read that they suggest to use wetted paper or clothes to hold the plants wet, or moss or sphagnum or ferns, and to avoid that the plants were too much pressed. Plants, if you want to identify the plants afterward, the plants may be preserved in good condition and not too flat. But I wonder how they did for not mixing all their collection. I don't know. Maybe they used little etiquettes. I don't know.
Yeah, or drawings, I don't know. Glenn, do you have anything to add?
No, because I don't think I saw any references to that. There's some references about how the plant should be sent back to the UK from Darwin on his time at the Beagle, but not that cover the actual collecting of them.
No, I don't know either, actually, I have to say. Someone else says, were specimens preserved in spirits or other fluids when placed inside a vasculum, or was the vasculum refrigerated in some ways to preserve the plants?
The Vasculum was not refrigerated, but I read that some people suggest that it would be better to use a white Vasculum and not a dark one, because a white Vasculum will not be become too warm with the sun, and with a black Vasculum or a dark green Vasculum, the sun has more effect for warming the plants. But there are only a few white Vasculums. It seems that people prefer black one or green ones, maybe because they were not too visible, I don't know the English term, on the field. The botanist can herborize incognito. It's too evident when you use a white Vasculum.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions actually comparing the Vasculum to the Wardian case, and someone says it's more recent than the Vasculum. Actually, I think it is in a way, but it's 1830s, 1840s if I remember well. I don't know. There's another question: did Darwin ever use a Wardian case? I don't actually know. But if you want to find out more about the Wardian case, actually Nathaniel Backshaw Ward was one of our fellows. There's a big portrait of him in our meeting room with the Wardian case at the back. And as Padma has just posted on the chat, we did have a Nature Reader talk about the Wardian case several months ago, and that presentation will be on YouTube. But I don't know if you want to say anything about this, Régine or Glenn.
I think the Wardian case is usually bigger than a Vasculum, and it is not used to carry a collection on the field. It's mainly used on the boats to bring back the plants, the living plants, without the fear they would be killed by the salt from the sea. And Wardian case were also used to cultivate ferns inside the houses.
Yes, you're right. Actually, that was the key point to make, is that the use of it is completely different. Yeah. So there's a question I've been not ignoring, but leaving it because it doesn't really relate to the case. So I will get to your question, Naomi. Just bear with me. Louisa wants to know, Régine, could you please repeat the German name for the Vasculum?
Botanisiertrommel. B-O.
Do you want to put it in the chat, actually? Because if everyone's like me,
okay.
German, I can't do listening. It needs to be written. And I'll let her do it because the other one is for Régine as well.
And children says,
actually, that's a really good question, and I don't know either. Maybe Glenn, you know, what is the plural of Vasculum? Is it vasculi, vascular? Because it's presumably is neutral in Latin, so it should be vascular.
Some people say vascula.
Yeah, vascular. Yeah. I think we've gone for vascular, although in modern language, I think most people call them vasculums. So
yes, it's a bit like herbarium and herbaria.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And could Régine please clarify the position regarding the covert nature of plant collection? So when you were saying that the botanist is invisible, more invisible if the Vasculum is not white, I guess the question means, why would a botanist want to remain invisible? Is that?
Because people thought they were poachers or smugglers, or they hide potatoes stolen in the fields, or they were suspected to poison the fields with the sand that remains in the Vasculum from the former trip. And people were always asking questions to botanists, and botanists prefer to remain more discreet, maybe.
Yeah, they looked more inconspicuous,
Yes.
rather than suspicious.
Yes.
And I've left that one question, which is not specifically on the Vasculum, for the end. Although if you still have a question, please don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A box. Could you please comment on the influence on Charles Darwin of his grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, which is more of a historical, biographical question? If any of you want to tackle?
No, I don't have any idea.
I'm not a Darwin scholar by any stretch of imagination. My Ladybird book proves that. But reading about Darwin, it's quite obvious that Erasmus Darwin, absolutely, Erasmus Darwin, who was also a scientist, and I think that he must have had an incredible influence. I mean, I think Erasmus Darwin, John Stevens Henslow, who we've not mentioned at all this afternoon, was another big influence on Darwin, particularly in his studies of botany. And of course, Darwin became nicknamed as the man who walks with Henslow, as one of his nicknames. I'm slightly avoiding the question because I don't know, but other than if you read about Erasmus Darwin, I mean, he was an incredible force. And I think both in terms of being a father and also in terms of his kind of scientific exploration and his own knowledge of the natural world. So yes, I suppose the answer is yes, he must have been incredible influence. So.
I would agree. I mean, the one thing again, like you, I'm more knowledgeable about Linnaeus than Darwin, but linked to that, Erasmus Darwin obviously published the Linnean sexual system of classifying plant in his Love of the Plants poem. And I believe he had some ideas, but I don't want to go too far into this because that's where I reach the limit of my knowledge. But he had some ideas about well, not evolution per se, but plant generation, etc. But yes, as someone said, he was very much into botany rather than zoology.
Yeah, and there's a nice account in one of the biographies of Darwin where one of his siblings talks about a very young Charles Darwin being shown the structure of flowers from the garden at the Mount by his mother. And she was explaining, this is Susanna Darwin's kind of explaining to Charles Darwin kind of the structure of the flowers, and it's been speculated that maybe there she was trying to teach him about the sort of Linnean sexual system of classification. So
I think that's where we're going to end it on that question, because none of the three of us are Darwinian scholars. So there are no more questions, and it's 3 o'clock, so perfect timing. If anybody else has a question, please don't hesitate to actually put it in the Q&A now, or raise your hand so that Padma can unmute you if you've got something to add. Otherwise,
maybe I can give my email if somebody is interested to get in touch.
Yes, of course. Régine,
yes, I put in the chat.
That's fine. That's fine. And while Régine does this, I will thank Glenn Benson and Régine Fabri for coming over and being so good with so many cameras and objects and etc. Thank you to Will, our librarian, who's been in the background helping for it to be so smooth. And see you all soon for another Linnean Lens, which will probably be in September. We have a couple of subjects up our sleeves. I think Will is planning to talk about a beautifully hand illustrated copy of Smith's British Flora, but everything will be on our website in due course. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to Glenn and Régine for such interesting talks, and see you all very soon. Bye-bye.